Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Colon Township, Michigan, April 26, 2010. It should have been just another quiet morning in this rural community, but it turned into the kind of day that reshaped an entire town's sense of safety. 32-year-old Venus Stewart, a mother of two, stepped out of her parents' front door to collect the mail and never returned. Her purse, phone, and keys remained untouched inside. Her car sat idle in the driveway. There were no footprints to follow, no forced entry, no sound of struggle. In the space of just a few minutes, an ordinary routine hardened into the start of a crime that would grip investigators for years. The Stewart home, tucked into a quiet stretch of countryside, was the last place Venus was seen. Within minutes of her leaving the front porch, the silence became noticeable. By mid-morning, her parents realized something was wrong. She had gone outside around 8 a.m., but by 11 the mailbox was still full, the dog was restless, and Venus had not returned. Her father picked up the phone and dialed 911, reporting what he described as an impossible disappearance. Deputies from St. Joseph County arrived within minutes and began the first sweep of the property. Inside the house, deputies observed what investigators call quiet anomalies. Nothing was overturned. The doors were intact. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no indication of violence, but the very absence of disturbance suggested something unusual. Venus's belongings were in place, her purse on the counter, her cell phone idle. For a mother navigating a custody dispute, one known to keep in constant contact with her daughters, leaving without any of these essentials was unthinkable. That absence of activity became negative evidence in itself. Officers moved quickly to establish a baseline timeline. Venus was last confirmed inside the home the night before, tending to her daughters. By 7:30 that morning, the household was awake. By 8, she was reportedly seen at the mailbox. By 11, she had vanished. At 11:15 a.m., her father made the emergency call. By noon, investigators were on site, marking down every detail. That left a gap of less than 3 hours in which she could have been taken. For law enforcement, the clock was already against them. Standard first response protocol unfolded. Deputies secured the house, logged every entry and exit, and began canvassing neighbors. A few reported possibly seeing Venus outside earlier that morning, but their recollections varied. Some thought it was closer to 8, others weren't certain. As is common in the immediate aftermath of disappearances, memory was imprecise. Investigators took notes but drew no conclusions. K-9 units were brought in to trace her scent around the yard and along the nearby roadway. The dogs found nothing. No trail led away from the driveway. That silence carried weight. In missing person work, no scent line often meant no voluntary walkaway. Search teams expanded outward. By late afternoon, volunteers and deputies lined the fields, scouring ditches and tree lines. ATVs and mounted patrols covered the rural perimeter. Helicopters surveyed from above. Still, no trace. The absence of evidence became a louder signal with every hour that passed. In many cases, even an intentional disappearance leaves digital footprints, phone calls, bank withdrawals, emails. By the first evening, investigators had confirmed there were none. Her accounts were untouched, her phone silent. By nightfall, the case was moving from a missing person classification toward suspicion of foul play. In small towns like Colon, Michigan, a sudden silence could not be ignored. This was a place where people noticed when something was off, and everyone agreed this was not a situation that fit a voluntary walkaway. The unanswered questions were stacking too quickly. Who would abduct a woman in daylight, leaving no visible trace? Was it someone who knew her routine or someone who knew the property well enough to approach unnoticed? Media outlets picked up the story almost immediately. A mother had disappeared in broad daylight, her children safe inside, her parents bewildered, and investigators without a single physical lead. Press conferences were brief but clear. Law enforcement asked for tips, volunteers gathered to continue the search, and a small town became the center of statewide attention. As night fell over Colon Township, deputies secured the Stewart home for continued processing, documenting every corner, every item in place. The data was too clean. Sometimes investigators later admitted that was the problem. No break-in meant control, no trail meant planning. The lack of evidence, instead of clearing the scene, made it all the more suspicious. It was the beginning of a long investigation that would test the limits of forensic reconstruction. And that first night set the tone. Venus Stewart was not missing by choice. Something, or someone, had intervened. When investigators finally had human remains to examine, the case entered a different phase. What began as a missing person call now required the careful, clinical handling of evidence at the medical examiner's office. Forensic experts often refer to the body as its own crime scene. Every fiber, every fragment of bone, every trace collected from a burial site carries information. Handling those details correctly is the difference between speculation and evidence that stands up in court. Once the recovery team completed the excavation, the remains were transferred under strict chain of custody. Each bag was sealed, tagged, and logged with timestamps, signatures, and transport notes. Officers who had been working the case for years stood by in silence as the transfer vehicle left the wooded site. It was a reminder that closure in homicide investigations is never clean. The discovery of a body brings answers, but also confirms the finality of loss. At the morgue, the process was methodical. The medical examiner and forensic pathologist worked in a sterile suite, recording every item. Photographs were taken before the remains were disturbed. Soil samples were preserved to test for foreign particulates. The clothing and wrappings were examined separately, with technicians cataloging fibers and debris. Even after years underground, trace evidence can survive. Plant matter that identifies a burial site, insect activity that narrows down a post-mortem interval, or adhesive residues that suggest restraints. The remains themselves presented the next challenge. After 8 years in Michigan soil, decomposition was advanced. Forensic anthropology became central. Specialists documented skeletal integrity, dental characteristics, and any signs of trauma that could survive the passage of time. DNA samples were collected from bone marrow. The comparison with family reference samples confirmed identity. For the family, there was finally no doubt the remains belonged to Venus Stewart. Cause of death, however, could not be conclusively established. The skeletal condition offered limited information. No bullet fragments were recovered, no obvious fractures that pointed to blunt force. The official classification was cause of death, undetermined. For prosecutors, this meant the original conviction from 2011 remained grounded in circumstantial evidence rather than new forensic discovery. But for investigators, the recovery still mattered. It validated the narrative they had presented to the jury years earlier. Chain of custody documents became part of the official record. Each signature, each timestamp formed a legal backbone for future hearings or appeals. When cases extend over years, defense teams often challenge evidence handling. A clean, uninterrupted chain demonstrates that nothing was added, removed, or contaminated between the scene and the courtroom. In the Stewart case, every step was documented with precision. Forensic examiners also noted the burial environment. The site was remote, accessible by back roads, shielded by tree cover. Soil compaction suggested deliberate digging, not a shallow concealment. Items recovered nearby matched purchase records tied to the suspect years earlier. Tarps, binding materials, shovels. These became part of the secondary evidence log, connecting the physical scene to premeditated action. Observers in the room later recalled the subdued tone. There was no relief in confirming what many had suspected for years. The absence of a body had been the defense's strongest argument during trial. Now that absence was filled, but not in a way that altered the legal outcome. It only confirmed what the family already believed. Venus had not left willingly, and she had not survived that morning in April 2010. For viewers hearing this now, it raises a question worth reflecting on. How do you prove a crime when the most important piece of evidence, the body, is missing for years? Investigators in Michigan built their case on digital traces, testimony, and behavioral evidence. The later recovery did not redefine their work, but it did validate it. The morgue phase closed with a final report. Venus Stewart's remains were officially identified, cause of death undetermined, homicide suspected. The evidence log expanded, but the criminal narrative stayed intact. The focus of the investigation now shifted back to the digital and financial trail that first exposed inconsistencies in the suspect's story. When the search of the Stewart home yielded nothing, investigators shifted focus to what could not be erased: digital signals and financial trails. In modern investigations, when a physical scene is silent, Electronic records often provide the first cracks in an otherwise airtight story. That shift brought new momentum. Detectives began with Venus's cell phone. Her device had been left inside the house, a fact already raising suspicion. A mother in the middle of a custody dispute does not willingly leave her lifeline to her children. Forensic technicians pulled subscriber records and confirmed what the family already knew. There was no activity on the morning of April 26th. No calls placed, no texts sent, no data sessions initiated. In forensic terms, that negative activity suggested either incapacity or restraint. By contrast, her estranged husband's phone showed movements. His device pinged towers across state lines in ways inconsistent with the alibi he provided. Investigators interviewed his online gaming contact, a man named Ricky Spencer. The friend explained that on the morning of Venus's disappearance, he had been asked to log into a video game account and pose as if he were playing from Virginia. That simple action was meant to support an alibi, projecting the appearance that the suspect was at home. For law enforcement, this was not speculation. It was a working lead supported by login records and corroborating testimony. The friend's cooperation gave investigators a time-stamped sequence that undercut the alibi with digital precision. Call detail records reinforced the inconsistency. Cell site analysis placed the suspect's phone along major routes in the Midwest, far from the home in Virginia where he claimed to be. While in 2010 GPS data was not routinely available, tower hits were sufficient to establish movement patterns. For jurors, those movements would later be presented as evidence of travel toward Michigan. Financial activity provided a second layer. Purchase receipts showed transactions for supplies that would later be found at the burial site: tarps, gloves, digging tools. At the time, these purchases did not stand out, but in hindsight, they became part of the circumstantial chain. Detectives matched dates, store locations, and payment methods. Each link tied planning behavior to the time frame of Venus's disappearance. Investigators also reviewed Venus's own financial accounts. There were no withdrawals, no credit card charges, no signs she had attempted to leave voluntarily. For law enforcement, that absence was as meaningful as the receipts tied to the suspect. A missing person who vanishes by choice still needs resources. Venus's accounts were static from the moment she disappeared. That silence aligned with the physical evidence from her home. She had not walked out, she had been taken. The digital reconstruction became a procedural turning point. It was no longer a vague narrative of disappearance, but a timeline supported by electronic data, corroborating witness testimony and documented financial records. Even without a cause of death, investigators had a structured case. What stands out in reviewing this phase is how much investigative work depends not on what can be seen, but on what can be proven through records. Eyewitness memory may falter, but a call log is not subjective. A friend may hesitate, but login data is not negotiable. When investigators presented this information to the prosecutor's office, they knew they had shifted the weight of the investigation. At the same time, these discoveries underscored the human side of the case. Venus was not just a missing entry in a log. She was a mother, separated from her daughters, trying to protect them through legal custody channels. The fact that her phone, bank accounts, and routine all went silent on the same morning painted a grim picture. It showed a life interrupted not by choice, but by force. And that realization carried emotional weight for the community as much as it carried evidentiary weight for the courtroom. Digital forensics also posed its challenges. Defense attorneys later argued that cell tower ranges were broad, that login records could not prove who was physically at a keyboard. Yet prosecutors countered with the layered approach: the friend's admission, the receipts, the phone data, and the absence of Venus's own digital footprint. Taken together, those details formed a consistent pattern. Investigators understood that this case would likely go to trial without a body. That meant circumstantial evidence had to be cohesive and airtight. The digital and financial review provided that cohesion. It tied actions to dates, places to times, and testimony to independent data sources. Reflecting on this stage today, it's worth asking, do digital records speak louder than eyewitnesses? In this investigation, they did. The electronic trail became the backbone of a homicide prosecution, demonstrating how modern crimes leave signatures even when offenders try to erase them. By the time this forensic phase closed, law enforcement had moved from uncertainty to structured suspicion. The focus shifted firmly onto one individual, and the legal framework for charging began to take shape. The next stage would require examining the life of Venus herself, not only to understand motive, but to give jurors the human context of what was lost. Venus Stewart was not a stranger to her own vulnerability. By the spring of 2010, she had left Virginia and returned to her parents' home in Colon Township, Michigan, bringing her two daughters with her. That move wasn't casual. It was a protective choice, shaped by years of strain in her marriage. Custody petitions, hearings, and protective orders had stacked up in county files. Each page told the same story: a young mother trying to shield herself and her children from a man she no longer trusted. Investigators working a disappearance must separate background noise from red flags. In Venus's life, there was no ambiguity. Records from court proceedings documented allegations of domestic intimidation. Friends described her as careful, cautious, and increasingly wary of her estranged husband. She had changed routines, avoided places he might appear, and sought refuge in her family's home. When a woman in that position vanishes, law enforcement does not treat it as an ordinary missing person report. Detectives reconstructed her daily life with precision. Venus was known to check the mailbox in the morning, usually while her children remained inside. She had no pattern of disappearing, no history of sudden trips, and no substance abuse. There was no evidence she had another relationship or an undisclosed financial plan. For investigators, those facts mattered. They meant her absence was inconsistent with everything established in her profile. As interviews expanded, investigators spoke with her parents, her daughters, and local acquaintances. The picture was consistent. Venus was described as a devoted mother, deeply connected to her children, not the type to abandon them without explanation. Teachers confirmed that she was involved in school routines. Neighbors recalled seeing her in the yard. These everyday details became forensic in their own right. They set a baseline of behavior against which the disappearance stood out. Victimology also uncovered escalation patterns. Court filings showed that in the months leading up to her disappearance, legal disputes had intensified. She had secured temporary custody and had limited her estranged husband's access to the children. In domestic violence investigations, those turning points are often dangerous. Research shows that separation is one of the highest risk periods for lethal outcomes. Detectives didn't need theory, they had a practical context. A mother in the middle of an acrimonious custody fight with documented fear of her spouse. The investigative team also reviewed correspondence. Venus had communicated with friends about feeling unsafe. These weren't generalized anxieties. They were specific. She expressed concern that her estranged husband might attempt to find her in Michigan, despite court orders. That kind of statement, corroborated by digital messages, carried weight in building a timeline of threat. It demonstrated pre-incident fear, which in homicide investigations is often treated as an early warning. In the context of forensic victimology, law enforcement doesn't just catalog fears, they weigh them against opportunity. Could the estranged spouse have traveled? Did he have resources to stage an approach? Financial analysis, already underway, showed he had the means and had recently purchased equipment later linked to burial. Victimology connected motive with method. The escalation was not only on paper. Witnesses recalled that Venus had altered routines, preferring not to go out alone. She parked in the driveway instead of on the street, avoided public outings with the children, and stayed within her parents' property whenever possible. Those protective adjustments showed anticipation of harm. That anticipation, tragically, aligned with the outcome. For investigators, presenting this background to prosecutors served two functions. It explained why Venus would not voluntarily disappear, and it demonstrated the trajectory of a relationship that had moved from control to intimidation to disappearance. Jurors in a no-body homicide case require context. Victimology gave them that context. It was not speculation. It was documented escalation supported by legal filings, witness testimony, and behavioral records. The human dimension was stark. A woman in her late 20s trying to start over was cut off mid-stride. Her daughters, too young to grasp the full implications, became central to the investigation. Interviews with family emphasized that the children asked for their mother constantly in the days following her disappearance. That detail, included in reports, underscored the urgency investigators felt. Missing person cases are about individuals, but they ripple outward, destabilizing families and communities. Even in the controlled language of police reports, the escalation was unmistakable. This was not random victimization. It was targeted, foreseeable, and rooted in a deteriorating relationship. Forensic victimology is often criticized as being too interpretive, but in this case it provided the necessary narrative thread. It explained not only what might have happened, but why Venus was specifically at risk. By the close of this phase, investigators had a coherent alignment of digital data, financial receipts, and victim context. What remained was to connect these findings into a charging theory that would withstand courtroom scrutiny. A no-body prosecution demands that all elements converge: opportunity, motive, and behavior. Victimology supplied the motive. Forensic evidence supplied the opportunity. The next procedural step would be to see whether prosecutors were prepared to convert that convergence into a formal homicide charge. When a missing person report becomes a homicide investigation without a body, prosecutors must weigh every thread of evidence. By the summer of 2010, detectives in Michigan had already built a profile of Venus Stewart's life that strongly indicated she did not leave voluntarily. The next step was to determine whether they had enough to frame a charging theory that could withstand a courtroom test. The St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department and the Michigan State Police worked jointly with prosecutors. Their immediate problem was straightforward but severe. Venus was gone, and there was no body to confirm cause of death. American juries are hesitant to convict in such cases unless the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Prosecutors needed to demonstrate three things: that Venus was dead, that her disappearance was not accidental or self-imposed, and that her estranged husband was responsible beyond reasonable doubt. The first hurdle was legal sufficiency. Prosecutors reviewed her history, routines, and obligations. Venus had children she was actively parenting, financial accounts she did not abandon, and prescriptions left untouched. In legal terms, these were indicators of continued life that had suddenly stopped. Courts have long treated such negative evidence as compelling proof of death in no-body cases. Investigators also presented the pattern of custody disputes and documented fear. This was not simply character testimony. It established motive. Prosecutors argued that Venus had taken steps to protect herself and her children, and that the breakdown of her marriage was reaching a critical point. The custody fight had stripped her estranged husband of regular access. For prosecutors, motive was clear. Control had been lost and retaliation followed. Physical evidence, though limited, carried weight. Purchases made in the days before her disappearance included materials later determined to be used in burial. Surveillance records showed movements consistent with premeditation. Phone activity provided critical gaps. While Venus's phone went silent, her estranged husband's phone registered travel anomalies, supported by corroborating statements. In court filings, this kind of alignment of digital and physical activity is framed as circumstantial but cumulative. Detectives also collected testimony from neighbors who described seeing a suspicious figure outside the Stewart residence. Though identification was inconclusive, the timing matched known travel windows. In no-body prosecutions, even uncertain eyewitness accounts can be used to reinforce patterns when combined with corroborative data. By September 2010, prosecutors presented these findings to a grand jury. Their argument was procedural and precise. They acknowledged the absence of a body, but emphasized the volume of consistent circumstantial evidence. The grand jury agreed. There was probable cause to indict Douglas Stewart on charges of first-degree murder and parental kidnapping. This was a high-stakes move, signaling confidence that the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to meet the burden of proof. The indictment did not guarantee conviction. Defense attorneys immediately argued that without a body, the state could not prove that Venus was dead or that her estranged husband was responsible. They highlighted the absence of forensic confirmation. No blood, no DNA, no crime scene in the traditional sense. Their strategy was to frame the disappearance as unresolved, with the possibility that Venus had chosen to vanish. Prosecutors countered with consistency. They pointed out that no money had been withdrawn from her accounts, no phone calls placed, and no confirmed sightings after April 2010. Forensic victimology, already outlined in earlier chapters, was central here. Prosecutors used it to demonstrate that voluntary disappearance was implausible. Interagency cooperation also shaped the charging theory. The FBI provided consultative expertise on no-body homicides, reinforcing that convictions were possible if the evidence was layered correctly. They reviewed travel records, call detail logs, and behavioral evidence, and confirmed that the cumulative profile was consistent with homicide by a known offender. In preparing for trial, prosecutors organized evidence into a clear sequence. They planned to lead the jury through Venus's life, the morning of her disappearance, and the alignment of circumstantial indicators pointing to her estranged husband. They would then layer in motive through custody disputes, financial transactions that suggested preparation, and testimony about prior threats. The strategy was to create a chain where every link reinforced the same conclusion. The choice to pursue first-degree murder underscored the confidence prosecutors had in premeditation. This was not framed as a crime of passion, but as a deliberate act. The purchase of equipment, the timing of travel, and the abrupt halt in Venus's communications built that argument. Jurors would be asked to see not an isolated disappearance, but a coordinated act of planning, execution, and concealment. This step, building a charging theory in a no-body case, reflects a broader lesson in American criminal law. Sometimes justice depends on convincing a jury that absence itself is evidence. Venus's absence was total, permanent, and inconsistent with her character and obligations. For prosecutors, that absence was proof of death. At this stage, the human element remained visible. Her parents continued to appear in local media, pleading for answers and supporting law enforcement. Their grief was not presented as evidence, but it shaped public understanding. In communities like Colon Township, where violent crime is rare, the disappearance of a mother in broad daylight was enough to fracture trust in ordinary routines. By late 2010, trial preparations were underway. Prosecutors had secured an indictment, built a theory, and prepared to present their narrative to a jury. The defense strategy was clear: challenge the sufficiency of evidence and argue that doubt remained. What followed would test the strength of circumstantial cases in American courts. The investigation in Michigan did not stall for long. By the summer of 2010, prosecutors in St. Joseph County had assembled a body of circumstantial and digital evidence that painted a clear direction. Even without a recovered body, the case advanced quickly toward a courtroom. In American criminal law, charging a defendant with homicide without a victim's remains is rare, but it is not unprecedented. Prosecutors faced the familiar burden: convincing a jury that the absence of a body did not equal the absence of a crime. They relied on digital trails, eyewitness statements, and forensic analysis that had been collected methodically over months. The trial of Douglas Stewart began in 2011. Local residents followed every development, as the disappearance of Venus Stewart had unsettled Colon Township for more than a year. Jury selection was the first hurdle. Potential jurors were asked whether they could set aside the fact that Venus's body had not been found. Some admitted openly they would struggle to convict in a no-body prosecution. Others expressed confidence that evidence, if persuasive, could stand on its own. Eventually, 12 jurors and 2 alternates were sworn in. From the outset, the prosecution framed the narrative directly. Venus was not missing voluntarily. She had been taken and killed. They introduced timelines reconstructed from phone records, surveillance footage, and physical evidence tied to Douglas. They called neighbors and family members who testified to Venus's daily routines and her abrupt disappearance from her parents' front yard on that April morning. The absence of calls, messages, or transactions in the hours and days that followed underscored the point. The defense countered with a familiar strategy: challenge every inference, highlight the lack of direct proof, and remind jurors of the presumption of innocence. They argued that without a body, no one could be certain Venus was dead. They raised the possibility she might have fled or met with an unknown third party, yet the lack of supporting evidence for those scenarios left them looking speculative. Inside the courtroom, each side leaned heavily on digital data. Cell site records placed Douglas away from his reported locations. Witnesses described a vehicle similar to his Near the Stewart residence at critical times, forensic specialists testified about the consistency of shoe impressions with his footwear. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was layered and mutually reinforcing. One striking moment came when investigators described their monitoring of Douglas after Venus's disappearance. He had been under surveillance, and his movements suggested a pattern of returning to remote wooded areas. The prosecution argued he was checking on a concealed burial site, though at that time no remains had been recovered. The jury heard these details as a window into behavior that aligned with guilt rather than grief. Family members of Venus sat in the gallery through every session, silent but visible. Their presence gave weight to the proceedings. For the jurors, it underscored the reality that a woman's life was missing from the community and that absence demanded an answer. The judge instructed jurors on the specific elements of homicide under Michigan law. The prosecution did not need to show a body if they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Venus was dead and that Douglas was responsible for her death. Case law in the state supported such prosecutions, though they remained difficult. The defense attempted to cast doubt by questioning the reliability of the surveillance evidence and the interpretation of phone records. They argued investigators had built a narrative first and fit the evidence around it. But the prosecution reminded jurors that Douglas had provided conflicting statements and that his own timeline failed to align with objective data. As the trial unfolded, the absence of Venus's voice was felt. Prosecutors read from her personal communications in the weeks before her disappearance, showing she was making plans for her children and pursuing divorce proceedings. These were not the messages of someone preparing to vanish. They were the words of a woman still rooted in daily life. Closing arguments brought the tension into sharp relief. Prosecutors stood before the jury and reminded them that Venus had left behind her purse, her phone, her car, and most importantly, her children. People do not walk away from everything without trace. The defense urged the jurors not to fill gaps with assumptions, insisting that the prosecution's case required leaps of faith. Deliberations began. Jurors spent hours reviewing the evidence, debating the strength of the circumstantial case. Later reporting indicated they were struck most by the consistency of multiple data points, phone records, vehicle sightings, and Douglas's own inconsistencies. Together, those elements formed a picture that outweighed speculation. Within 2 days, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Douglas Stewart stood in the courtroom, silent as the words were read. Venus's parents held hands, tears in their eyes, relieved that the legal system had acknowledged what they had feared since that April morning, that their daughter was gone and that she had not left willingly. The conviction carried an automatic life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge delivered the sentence immediately, a routine step in a Michigan first-degree homicide conviction. Douglas was escorted from the courtroom while the family of Venus left with both grief and a measure of validation. In the broader context, the trial became another entry in the narrow but growing history of successful no-body prosecutions in the United States. It demonstrated how layered circumstantial evidence, when presented coherently, could meet the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. For the community, it reaffirmed that even without physical remains, justice could move forward. Still, questions lingered. Where was Venus? For all the relief of a conviction, the absence of her body left a gap that no verdict could fill. For the Stewart family, closure remained partial. They knew who had taken her life, but they did not know where her remains lay. For investigators, the search did not end with the verdict. Files stayed open and leads continued to be checked. The prosecution was complete, but the pursuit of answers was not. In towns across America, families watching the case saw a reminder of how fragile justice can be when evidence is hidden and lives are cut short. Nobody cases walk a difficult line. They demand jurors to trust in the weight of indirect proof. But when juries do, as they did here, it affirms that absence itself can be powerful evidence. As the chapter of the trial closed, another opened. The long wait for discovery that would not come until 2018. The 2011 conviction of Douglas Stewart did not close the matter for Venus's family. A guilty verdict brought legal certainty, but the absence of her body left an unresolved silence. For Douglas, it became the foundation of his appeals. His defense argued the jury had relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. cell site data, surveillance, and testimony, without the physical remains to anchor the crime. Appellate briefs warned of precedent, punishing without a body. Yet each Michigan court upheld the conviction. Judges noted the layered consistency of evidence and the absence of any alternative explanation for Venus's disappearance. For Venus's parents, every appeal was a reopening of wounds. Headlines repeated the same phrase, convicted without a body. The words reminded them daily of what they had not been able to bury. Holidays passed, birthdays came. Their daughter was both declared dead and still missing. Investigators did not stop searching. Teams checked wooded areas, sand pits, and rural land. Dogs were deployed. Every tip was chased. The truth was that without cooperation from Douglas, efforts were blind. Still, detectives refused to abandon the file. In prison, Douglas maintained innocence. He told correspondents the system had erred, that he had been punished for a crime unproven. Yet by 2018, something shifted. Whether from guilt, strategy, or the wear of years, he chose to talk. That summer, Douglas guided investigators to a remote spot in Kalamazoo County. Beneath the soil lay skeletal remains. The chain of custody was strict. Each bone was documented, collected, and transferred to state forensic labs. The results confirmed what the family had long known. Venus Stewart had been murdered and buried in secrecy. For the state, the discovery validated the prosecution's original case. For the family, it allowed the first act of closure. A funeral, a headstone, a final resting place. It did not lessen the loss, but it ended 8 years of uncertainty. This sequence, trial without body, appeals denied, eventual recovery, is rare in American homicide. It demonstrates both the resilience of circumstantial prosecutions and the persistence of families and investigators who do not stop pressing. Venus's name remains in Michigan court records as the victim of a crime solved without her presence in evidence. The final act, her recovery in 2018, was not about Douglas Stewart, but about restoring dignity to her memory. By 2018, 8 years after Venus Stewart vanished, Douglas Stewart finally broke his silence. Under escort, he led investigators to the wooded site where he had hidden her remains. The recovery ended the no-body uncertainty that had defined the trial, confirming what prosecutors had argued years earlier. Venus had been murdered. For her family, this discovery allowed a proper burial and the chance to mark her life with dignity. Colon, Michigan, gathered not to revisit the crime but to remember Venus as a mother, daughter, and friend. The community saw firsthand that justice is not only the conviction, but also the closure of knowing where a loved one rests. Legally, the case remains one of Michigan's most significant no-body convictions. The later recovery of Venus's remains validated the persistence of detectives and prosecutors who had relied on digital records, witness accounts, and inconsistencies to secure a life sentence against Douglas Stewart. Douglas will remain in prison for life without parole. Venus's family can now stand at her grave, no longer asking where, but finding strength in knowing the truth. Cause of death: homicide confirmed. Conviction stands. This crime reminds us that persistence matters, because even years later, truth can still be brought to light. Looking back, this crime reminds me how fragile safety can be, and how justice often takes persistence, not just patience. Venus Stewart's story is not only about loss, but about the power of truth finally breaking through years of denial. As someone walking you through this case, I ask, what do we take from it? For me, it's the importance of never ignoring small warning signs, of standing firm when others try to minimize danger, and of believing victims when they speak. What do you think? Does closure after so many years change the way we heal? If this video reached you, let me know in the comments, share your thoughts, or even just where you're watching from. And if you want more true crime stories told with respect and depth, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what comes next.